Hello, everybody. It is Tuesday, February the 3rd, 2026. Almost 4 years ago, we had the great British environmentalist George Monbiot on the show, talking about how to feed the world without devouring the planet. Back then, he'd written a book called Regenesis, Feeding the World without devouring the planet. And it was about the way in which our soil has been essentially devoured by cattle. And he really reiterated the catastrophic consequences of cattle and our obsession with meat. We're back on the subject of meat today. A new book is out by Bruce Friedrich, a vegan, entitled Meat: How the Next Agricultural Revolution Will Transform Humanity's Favorite Food and Our Future. And Bruce is joining us from Washington, D.C., where we live. Bruce, you're a noted vegan, anti-meat guy. How have you come out with a book called Meat?
I don't know how noted I am, Andrew, but that's very nice of you. The focus of meat, like the opening line, is something very close to, let me get one thing out of the way. I'm not here to tell anybody what to eat. And the idea of the book, taking a page from movements for renewable energy and electric vehicles, is to say, okay, people want to consume more energy. Let's shift off of fossil fuels and make that energy using solar, wind, nuclear, renewable sources. Or the idea of electric vehicles is to say, yes, people are going to drive more miles every year they do, but we can decarbonize transportation by shifting to electric vehicles. Same thing here. Every year that the Food and Agriculture Organization has measured since they started in 1961, every single year we've set a new global record for the amount of meat produced and consumed. And that has a bunch of adverse consequences that I'm sure we're going to talk about. But people really love meat. We appear to be biologically, physiologically programmed to really love meat. So instead of trying to, exclusively beg people to eat less meat, let's shift the conversation and see if we can use science to make something that is identical to the meat that people love, but less expensive because it's so much more efficient. So that's plant-based meat, that's cultivated meat.
That seems to be the headline, Bruce, of the book that's out today, is that you've come around to acknowledging that we humans are somehow biologically, if not addicted, certainly enamored by meat. Why have you changed your mind on this position? Because, as I said, you were noted as an anti-meat activist. I certainly wouldn't describe you as a pro-meat activist, because, as you say, your new book is in favor of a different kind of meat. But what's changed your mind about our relationship with meat?
Well, I, as you noted, I adopted a vegan diet in 1987, so 39 years ago. And I really did think in the early days that if people understood the inefficiency of growing crops and cycling them through animals, that people would be concerned by that. So the book that turned me vegan was Diet for a Small Planet by Frances Moore Lappé. And she basically argues that growing crops to feed them to animals so that we can eat animals is incredibly inefficient. So it's environmentally problematic. But worse than that, it drives up the price of land. It drives up the price of cereals. And it literally leads to hunger, malnutrition, starvation. And most people haven't really thought about this, but if you're going to eat a chicken, it takes 9 calories fed to the chicken to get 1 calorie back out. So you have to grow all of these crops to feed them to the chicken. Most of those calories the chicken expends simply existing, getting up to slaughter weight. Some of it goes into things like feathers or bones or blood that we don't consume. And what that means is there's essentially 800% food waste just in the physiology of the chicken. And the chicken is the most efficient animal at turning crops into meat. So most of us, most people who are going to be listening or watching, are probably concerned about food waste. We waste something like 25% of the calories that we produce. So if you're producing 100 calories globally, you're going to waste about 25 of them. But to produce 100 calories of chicken, you're wasting 800 calories, more than 30 times as much, because you need 900 calories to produce 100. That drives up prices for the crops, for the land, and it directly contributes to hunger and malnutrition. I thought that argument was going to convince a lot of people to eat less meat back when I adopted a plant-based diet in 1987. But year by year by year, every year since 1987, meat consumption has gone up. And now it's up 2.5 times since 1987. Lots of examples of that. And it's just like energy transition. 20 years ago, the climate movement, the environmental movement was largely about how do we squeeze more energy efficiency out of things? How do we convince people to consume less? And that hasn't worked. Every year since forever, energy consumption has also gone up. And at some point, the environmental movement realized, hey, wait a minute, if we produce this energy using solar or wind or nuclear, a more efficient process, we can decarbonize the grid and solve our fossil fuel problem without requiring that people deny their natures, essentially, and consume less. It's the same thing here. We can make meat from plants. We can create something with plants that gives people the exact same experience. And because it's so much more efficient, it will cost less. And then similarly, just like you can take a seed or a cutting from a plant and grow a whole plant, you can take a small amount of animal muscle or animal fat and grow more animal muscle, more animal fat. And again, it's a far more efficient process. It's literally the exact same thing. And as it scales up, it will become cost competitive and then even less expensive.
It's interesting that you bring up solar. We had a few months ago Bill McKibben on the show. His latest book is Here Comes the Sun. I'm sure you're familiar with his argument. I'm sure you've read the book. Do you see what you're arguing in meat as being in some way similar to what McKibben suggests in Here Comes the Sun?
Yeah, it's very, very similar. Bill, one of the things that Bill is particularly well known for is the idea that the most important thing we can do is basically electrify all aspects of human production and then decarbonize electricity. And that is explicitly what I'm talking about in the book. So the plurality of methane and the majority of nitrous oxide, and methane over 20 years is about 80 times as carbon dioxide, CO2 equivalent. So as a contributor to climate change, methane is about 80 times as powerful over 20 years. Nitrous oxide is about 275 times as powerful. As much methane is caused by cattle digestion as by oil and gas put together.
Yeah, and that's George Monbiot. That was George Monbiot's point in Regenesis.
Yeah, and then nitrous oxide, the vast majority of it is from nitrogen-based manures, and you can slash the amount of nitrogen-based manure that you need if you're requiring far fewer crops, which is what comes with plant-based and cultivated meat. So it really is sort of the electrify everything for food because your production happens in a factory and you're no longer creating all of that nitrous oxide or any of that methane if you're shifting in this direction. And Bill McKibben actually did give me a very kind endorsement for the book, which I'm grateful for.
Bruce, you use this term deny their natures, but isn't nature itself malleable, plastic? Now we're increasingly taking drugs to change our natures, at least when it comes to our appetites. What do you mean by denying our nature in terms of eating or not eating meat?
I just mean that the vast majority of people love meat. The vast majority of people, something like 95 to 98% of people eat meat. The movement that is trying to mitigate some of the external costs of meat production have been telling people, hey, wait a minute, look at the environmental consequences. Look at the consequences for hunger and malnutrition. Look at the contribution to antimicrobial resistance and pandemic risk. Look at the cruelty to animals. The vast majority of people care about all of those issues. But when they sit down to eat, what they want is something that is delicious and affordable. And the vast majority of people find meat to be both of those things. So Certainly in some areas of life, like, the entire concept of government is arguably a denial of nature. We come together and figure out how we can get past the sort of red in tooth and claw of nature, and create, organizations and symbiotic cultural relationships. But at least where meat is concerned, we've been trying to convince people to eat less meat for more than 50 years, and yet meat consumption just keeps going up. I'm not suggesting that we should stop drawing attention to the external costs. I'm not suggesting that we should stop encouraging people to align their diets with their morals. But what I am suggesting is that we should also do this, because science can create meat from plants that is indistinguishable and less expensive. Science can create actual animal meat in factories without the need for live animals. And that will go a long way toward mitigating climate emissions, decreasing land use needs. It'll take antibiotics, human necessary antibiotics out of food production altogether, slash pandemic risk, cut cruelty to animals. It has a lot of benefits. We have not put much effort into it. And the argument of the book is that we should put a lot more effort into it. So not a silver bullet, not the only thing we should be doing, but we definitely should be doing this.
So over the last 20, 25, 30 years since you've been a vegan, is the great change in technology, our ability to create quote unquote meat that isn't from an animal but tastes like it and is increasingly hard to distinguish, is that the fundamental breakthrough?
I mean, cultivated meat actually is from an animal, just to say. So
could you explain and excuse the naivety of the question? What is cultivated meat?
Yeah, I mean, cultivated meat is basically the idea, and it's been pioneered by two medical doctors. So the first person to actually grow an actual hamburger from a cow, but without having to kill a cow, is a former professor of medicine at Harvard Medical School. He's a PhD, MD. His PhD is in tissue engineering. Now he's at Maastricht University in the Netherlands. His name is Mark Post. And Sergey Brin gave him 250,000 euros to create a cultivated burger. So roughly 300,000.
It's not a lot of money, certainly for Sergey Brin. He could probably spend that on a hamburger, let alone a major technological breakthrough.
Yeah, but the cost is down by a factor of 100,000. This was in August of 2013, so not quite 13 years ago. And Professor Post has brought the cost down by 99.999%. And it's just like anything else you're going to do with tissue engineering, except that it's a lot easier because you don't have to the fat and the muscle doesn't have to continue to exist on a living body, which is necessary for tissue engineering for therapeutics. So the idea, again, it's what I described earlier. You take a little bit, literally a sesame seeds amount of fat or muscle, and you give it basically media that causes it to grow. You keep it warm. You put it into a cultivator that looks an awful lot like a fermenter in a beer brewery, and you grow more animal meat. It doesn't require antibiotics. It doesn't contribute to pandemic risk. It requires, if you're looking at beef, it requires about 1/20 the land. If you're looking at chicken, it requires about 1/3 the land. Doesn't cause any cruelty to animals. It's just all around a better way of making actual animal meat. And hey, it's also a lot cleaner. If it's seafood, you don't have the mercury poisoning or the dioxins. If it's land animal meat, you don't have the antibiotic residues or any of the other drugs that are fed to animals in this country and around the world. So it's just a better product. And we call it, it is called cultivated meat.
What would you say to someone, a hardcore carnivore, Bruce, who says, I don't want to eat cultivated meat. I want to eat dead animals?
Well, nobody's going to force anybody to do anything. So, I mean, that is one of the more common responses from people who don't like this is you can't make me. And yeah, nobody's interested in making anybody do anything. But the polling everywhere in the world on cultivated meat is pretty good. Most people, and interestingly, it's the people who eat the most meat who are most enthusiastic about it. Unsurprisingly, vegetarians tend not to be very enthusiastic about it. They're not eating meat anyway. It's funny to me how many people will say, well, I'm not going to eat that. I'm a vegetarian. It's like, you're a vegetarian. I don't care what you eat. They're not contributing to the external costs of meat production. So it's encouraging that the people who eat the most meat are the most excited about cultivated meat. But I mean, I think at the end of the day, most people eat meat because it's delicious and it's affordable. If we can produce it in a better, more efficient, less harmful way, most people are excited about that.
I could easily be a vegetarian. I'm not, but I would struggle to be a vegan because I drink a lot of tea with milk and I like cheese. How does this impact on cheese and milk and yogurt?
There's a lot of really fascinating work happening across cheese, milk, and yogurt as well, using various legumes, using various nuts. And then there's something called precision fermentation, where you can basically program yeast to produce actual dairy or egg, the actual proteins. And it's, again, this is actually something that George talks about quite a bit in Regenesis, is the idea that, again, you can have basically a fermenter, and what the fermenter is producing is dairy proteins or egg proteins. The company Impossible Foods, that's how they produce the heme. So it's a soy-based heme, but there's not actually any soy involved because they just take the DNA of that heme, and they have yeast producing it, just like yeast can produce, beer or other things that can also produce animal proteins or soy proteins.
How does this revolution then impact on non-meat products, vegetables, fruit?
I'm not sure of anybody who's doing fruit using cultivation, but there are people doing chocolate using cultivation. So, I mean, and also precision fermentation. So, if it is a protein, you can produce it using precision fermentation, and really anything you could produce using cultivation. You would need probably to be looking at something like chocolate, where production practices are difficult. There are also obviously lab-grown diamonds, which is a similar process. So anything that anything that you can grow in nature, I imagine you could probably grow in a tank, which is basically what this looks like. It's essentially, we're looking at friendly neighborhood meat breweries. Is what this is looking like in the long term.
Bruce, we've done a lot of shows on regenerative agriculture. In fact, I was in Munich a couple of weeks ago and I did an interview with my old friend Jan Schultz, one of Europe's leading regenerative agriculture investors and activists. What will be the impact of this if your dream of a kind of meaty or a meaty, meatless world comes into being? What will be the impact on the soil?
I mean, the impact on the soil will be extraordinarily positive. The reason that, if you talk to people who are focused on regenerative agriculture, they will tell you that all of the chemicals we're dumping on the soil, as well as monocropping, various production practices that become required by the volume of agriculture that we are producing, which is artificially extraordinarily high because we're funneling so many crops to their animals. So as just one example, the World Resources Institute, alongside the World Bank, the UN Environment Program, the UN Development Program, they modeled our current trajectory of agriculture and said that in 2050, unless we have some very serious crop productivity gains, we're going to need another 3.3 billion hectares of land for agriculture. And that means no more forests, no more savannas, really no more wild spaces in that eventuality. And that's because the vast majority of agricultural land is used to either graze animals or to grow crops to feed them to animals in a world where it takes 9 calories in to get 1 calorie of chicken, 10 or 11 calories in to get 1 calorie of pork or fish, 40 to 100 calories in to get 1 calorie out of beef. So shifting away from that is going to be very good for the soil. It'll also be very good for regenerative agriculture. So my organization, the Good Food Institute, we have about 240 full-time staff. The plurality of our team members are scientists. And we have 6 GFIs around the world. So our European, GFI Europe, worked with a consultancy called Green Alliance, and they modeled 10 European countries and what shifting in the direction of protein transition of alternative proteins would look like. And they found that at a 2/3 transition, those 10 countries could get to food self-sufficiency. If you take 1/3 of the land and put it into producing crops for human beings, 1/3 of the land and put it into rewilding and growing forests, and then 1/3 of the land and shift in the direction of agroecology, in the direction of regenerative agriculture, you could 4x the amount of regenerative agriculture. So in the book, it's not no meat at all, but it is industrial animal meat, which is the vast majority of it. We can produce far more efficiently if we're doing plant-based meat and cultivated meat. And that will allow us for consumers, the Michael Pollins and others who are particularly concerned about regenerative or agroecologically produced beef, pork, chicken. We can 4x the amount of that exists now. Right now, at least in the US, it's about 0.1%. So shifting in the direction of not requiring that, all of that requires a lot more land. So it's better for the soil, it's better for farmers, it's better for biodiversity. What it's not better for is the climate, and it requires a lot more land. So alternative proteins can free up land and make those sorts of practices more viable.
Like so many other environmentalists, you're no great fan of industrial agriculture. I know you think it's shockingly inefficient. You're not alone there. George Monbiot, everybody, I think, in the environmental movement would agree. In our AI age, of course, Bruce, some people believe we're not going to have a lot to do. Is it conceivable that we're on the brink of an agricultural renaissance in America where people can go back to small farming activity, that this new technology will result in the demise of massive industrial agriculture and the renaissance of small farming? Is that utopian or realistic in the middle of the 21st century?
Well, I mean, I think it's both utopian and realistic. Gosh, I mean, I don't think anybody who tells you they know what AI is going to do to the global economy over the next 10 years. We can all speculate and discuss and do our best to prepare, but it's really just impossible to know. In chapter 10 of the book, I reflect on how we got where we are, which is to say every single year, more and more agricultural consolidation globally. It really started with Richard Nixon's Secretary of Agriculture.
Always starts with Nixon, Bruce, doesn't it?
Well, it did here, a guy named Earl Butz, and he was the one who
appropriately named, I think.
I know, seriously. And his, one of his mantras was "Get big or get out," and he meant it quite literally. He didn't have room for the idea of, I don't think there was anything had been named regenerative agriculture at that point. But after the Dust Bowl, the U.S. Agricultural Department really did, starting in the 30s, implement an awful lot of practices that were good for the soil, basically designed so that we would have productive lands for a really long time. Earl Butz really shifted in the direction of chemicals. He shifted in the direction of monocropping. He shifted in the direction of maximum possible productivity. And I don't know if it's every year since, but certainly every few years, we see everywhere in the world, fewer and fewer people farming, even as farms produce more and more of everything, essentially, almost everything. And that is destroying topsoil, and that is destroying farmer livelihoods, and that's doing the opposite of what you just described, this sort of renaissance of the small farmer. In the book, in chapter 10, I talk about the idea, I nodded at it a second ago, sort of your friendly neighborhood meat brewery. And also, if we didn't require so much land, if we didn't require so many crops, we could really rethink farming from the ground up and shift in the direction of healthier products, more fruits and vegetables, more legumes and cover crops, just vastly better production that is far more ecological, and a lot more sort of community-based, community-focused farming that puts farmer livelihoods at the center. And I like the idea that could also be something for people to do if AI is going to be ushering in a sort of age of idleness. A lot more people doing farming, maybe growing their own crops, people taking part in. There are a lot of jobs to be had in alternative proteins, and they're good jobs. You're not on an industrial farm. You're not in a slaughterhouse having to kill thousands of chickens per hour. These are good, productive jobs, and I could easily see both more people with more time, as well as land freed up, both feeding into a much healthier, kinder, more holistic agricultural system in the U.S. and around the world.
And of course, those slaughterhouse jobs were perhaps the worst jobs of all in the early industrial world, and there were many bad jobs back then. In media, Bruce, which is an area I'm more familiar with than food production, we've seen the radical democratization. So you and I are doing, quote unquote, a podcast, but we're doing it in video, in broadcast quality that 10, 15 years ago was unimaginable outside the professional studio. To what extent what you're describing in meat might be radically democratized so we can all become meat producers in our own, quote unquote, kitchens without even needing a farm?
Yeah, the Gates Foundation actually funded an organization, a company called Nature's Find, to do work focused on developing economies that's looking at, obviously we're seeing more and more droughts, which are killing both animals as well as decimating crop productivity. And what does it look like to shift in the direction of food systems resilience? And exactly what we're talking about now, either plant protein production or a sort of twist on plant protein production, mycoprotein, which is what the company Quorn, Q-U-O-R-N, does. In the book, at the very beginning of the book, I say that I'm going to talk about mycoprotein and plant protein in sort of the same way. The challenges are basically the same, but the production practices are a little bit different. And GFI India, one of the things we're really focused on in India is what does it look like to bring up both farmer incomes, but also rural wages in India, which have been stagnating or falling for quite some time. The same thing in Africa. And that would be shifting in the direction of community-based, back to your friendly neighborhood meat brewery. But in this case, it's sort of a community center where jobs and protein production happens. And then take it one step down from that, and the Gates Foundation funded Nature's Find to basically do tabletop, very high quality, very high protein, and you can use basically whatever you're producing from agriculture can be the ingredient into producing the mycoprotein and causing the mycoprotein to grow. And the idea would be the poorest communities in the world, if they are smallholder farmers, they can also produce protein in these essentially like tabletop meat makers. You can obviously imagine, scaling that up for developed economies as well. But it is certainly, it's both within the realm of possibility, and it's something that people are already looking at and experimenting with.
What's going to be the impact then of all this on food retail restaurants? Obviously the McDonald's sector, the fast food sector, as well as the higher end Whole Foods sector. To prepare for this, I went to my Whole Foods website, and they were advertising 25% off chicken legs if you have Prime ownership. Of course, Whole Foods is now owned by Amazon. How could you imagine your meat or your meatless meat revolution impacting on the fast food industry as well as the food retail industry? And of course, most beloved by many environmentalists, the farm or the farm to market sector.
Yeah, I mean, I think food prices go down. So meat prices go down, but so do all food prices go down. Unless we're making a considered decision to shift in the direction of practices that are going to cost a little bit more. That's not going to be self-actualizing. That's not something that's going to happen automatically. But in chapter 10 of the book, I say alternative meat production or alternative proteins, they are not a silver bullet. They don't solve everything that's wrong with our current agricultural system, but they give you some room to focus on things like agricultural consolidation because the system no longer has to be so focused on productivity and get big or get out. So there are a variety of options. The one that happens unless people get active and create a different future is probably Whole Foods and all of the chain restaurants from McDonald's to Chipotle to everything else. They just shift what it is that they're serving because cultivated meat is exactly the same product, but cleaner and less expensive. So there would be no reason to continue to serve this will be the least expensive meat and significantly better than what it was replacing. And then farm to table probably becomes more affordable again, because the land use needs in the feed crop demands go down, which makes it easier to produce regeneratively farmed animals as well. So, I mean, our hypothesis would be that the vast majority of people are buying meat because it's delicious, affordable. And so people who those are the two main variables, they'll shift to plant-based and cultivated meat. And then people who are willing to pay a little bit more for regeneratively farmed and agroecologically produced animal meat, they will do that. And that will be more affordable as well. You can imagine a political movement and political goals that focus on changing some of the other aspects of food production. And I think that would be valuable and important. Doesn't happen, it's not self-executing. It doesn't happen all by itself. But it certainly becomes easier if we're not in a world that is, where food production is so inefficient that the focus just has to be on more and more and more.
Yeah, one wonders what Donald Trump's reaction would be to his favorite hamburger no longer being made of quote unquote real meat. Bruce, you'll have to use your imagination for that one. You mentioned politics. There is no really powerful green political movement or green political party in the United States. To what extent is this techno-optimism that you articulate in meat and being articulated by other environmentalists, mentioned Bill McKibben earlier, to what extent is it being recognized and articulated in new political movements, perhaps in Europe or elsewhere?
I mean, so GFI, as I mentioned, we're in 6 areas of the world. So we're in India, Israel, Brazil, Asia Pacific.
And GFI is the Good Food Institute that you're the president and founder of.
Yeah, exactly. Sorry about that. So Japan, Korea, Singapore, all over Europe, the US, and every place that we operate, our focus is not on we should shift in this direction because of the climate or global health or hunger and malnutrition or animal benefits. Our focus is on economic competitiveness, food security, food systems resilience, those sorts of things. And that is really resonating. 7 years ago, no governments were funding science in this space. No governments were incentivizing their private sectors in this space. Now every government that funds any significant amount of biotechnology or any significant amount of agriculture is funding in this space. And that transcends party lines. So in Brazil, Bolsonaro was very supportive and enthusiastic about alternative proteins. In China, President Xi, obviously not a progressive, is enthusiastic about alternative proteins, and that's true everywhere. There's a little bit of culture war stuff happening in the U.S., but not a lot. JBS, the world's largest meat company, Tyson and Cargill, number 2 and number 3, are supportive of alternative proteins. It was Donald Trump's National Science Foundation that gave the first major grant for cultivated meat R&D in like 15 years. There had been one significant grant in, I think, 2005 from the Dutch government to Mark Post, the scientist I mentioned a little bit ago. And then in 2019, Donald Trump's NSF gave a $3 million plus grant to UC Davis for cultivated meat. It was Donald Trump's agriculture secretary and FDA commissioner in his first term who were responsible for the regulatory regime that allowed the United States to be the second company to approve, second country to approve cultivated meat for sale. And there are a lot of Republicans and a lot of Democrats who are enthusiastic about these technologies, mostly for economic reasons and then for food security reasons. And with the book, my number one choice to write the foreword was the woman at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, one of the top national security think tanks in the world. She had previously worked at the Department of State and the National Security Council, first under President Obama, then for almost all of President Trump's first term. Now she's the director of the Global Food and Water.
This is Caitlin Walsh, right?
Yes, exactly. And I wanted, she was my first choice to write the foreword. Her national security, food security credentials are, could not be better. And she enthusiastically agreed to write the foreword because she sees alternative proteins as a food and water security imperative. And in fact, CSIS wrote a report and they said the US government should prioritize these technologies alongside biopharma and advanced chips for artificial intelligence. Because our current food system, it's not just inefficient, but if you're growing all those crops and you're shipping them to a feed mill and you're operating the feed mill and you're shipping the feed to the farm and you're operating the farm and you're shipping the animals to the slaughterhouse, you're operating the slaughterhouse, that is a lot of fragility in the system. It's a lot of vulnerability, and the inefficiency in a lot of countries is going to contribute to food insecurity, to a lack of food self-sufficiency. And that's, something that governments like China, Korea, Japan, Singapore, Israel really care about.
Has RFK Jr. embraced this? What's his take? He's rather outspoken, obviously a very controversial figure. Guessing he's not particularly popular with most of our audience, but has he embraced this future that you're imagining in meat?
He hasn't embraced it. I don't know what he thinks about it. I've seen people say that he is antagonistic. I would be very surprised if that's true. I haven't seen anything from him to indicate that he's antagonistic. In his sort of previous life, he was an environmental lawyer. So he may have founded, I think, the Waterkeeper Alliance, but he was the lead lawyer and lead spokesperson for the Waterkeeper Alliance for a long time. So he was fighting industrial pig farms in North Carolina, industrial chicken farms in Delaware and Virginia and Maryland. So I don't know what he thinks, but it would definitely be a huge benefit for public health, which is something that he cares about. And it would be a huge benefit for the environment, also something that he cares about.
Yeah, the whole thing, the way you're presenting it, sounds like a no-brainer. I can imagine industrial agriculture being against it, but who else would be against this future? Obviously you're an advocate and you've written this book that's out today, Meat, but what's the best argument against it, Bruce? Is there an argument against it? Is there anything that you're slightly ambivalent about? Do we know all the technological and health implications?
I think we're pretty clear on the technological and the health implications. I think the biggest argument against it is we don't know if it will work. It has not worked yet. The response to that is we haven't tried very hard. 10 years ago, there was no Impossible Burger. There was no Beyond Burger. There's literally nobody trying to replicate the meat experience with plants. So in chapter 11 of the book, I talk about spending January through June of last year, reaching out to all of the top scientists in plant-based meat and cultivated meat, and basically pressure testing. I started with, can we make cheap plant-based chicken and cultivated chicken inexpensively enough to compete with industrial animal chicken? And then from there, what is it going to take? How long is it going to take? What kind of funding is going to be necessary? What are the most important things we can do? What are the key policies? So I talk about that experience in chapter 11, and everybody ends up very enthusiastic about first principles, which is to say, it's just so much more efficient if you're not growing live animals, cultivated meat, or if you're using plants, plant-based meat, just requires so much less land, fewer stages of production, far fewer inputs. The science, we absolutely should be able to do this. And as it scales up, it should cost less. But we don't know for sure. And I spend a lot of time in chapter 8 just saying, it's the nature of innovation that things take time. And we've barely gotten started on both plant-based meat and cultivated meat. And we've put very little money and effort into it relative to any technological development that has been successful in the past. So I talk about things like in the first 10 years of the automobile, 1900 to 1910 roughly, 500 car companies went bust, not because automobiles don't work, but because running a company is hard, and until Henry Ford innovated in 1908 and made them easier to start, easier to run, and cheaper, they really were deficient products. But and then similarly, you flash forward 100 years from that, and you've got the dot-com bubble, where the NASDAQ lost 80% of its value. More than half of internet commerce companies went bankrupt. Pets.com, in the sort of the expert class, the intelligentsia, the commentators were just ruthless. Like, who's ever going to want to buy pet supplies online? They sort of scoffed incredulously. Or when is this Jeff Bezos character ever going to turn a profit? Amazon dropped from $213 a share to less than $6, so more than 95% of its value. Pets.com went from $400 million market cap to zero, went bankrupt. And now Chewy is worth more than 30 times that. It's got a market cap of about $13 billion, and Amazon also doing okay. But all of that, I can say all of that, and it's still true that the plant-based products mostly don't taste very good, and they cost too much. And a lot of articles have been written that basically say, impossible and beyond, tried and failed, the experiment is over. And then we point out, if we felt that way about electric vehicles, we would have written the whole thing off in 2006, which was 10 years after GM launched the EV1. At that point, there were no electric vehicles sold anywhere in China or the US or most of Europe, and we would have written it off. The science on this is very strong, and the first principles and about being able to bring down costs are very strong. And there's just an absolute imperative for people who care about things like hunger and malnutrition, climate and biodiversity, deforestation, antimicrobial resistance. Like, all of these problems are getting worse, and they're all going to continue to get worse if meat consumption just keeps going up, which is the trajectory we're on right now. In 2006, the UN Food and Agriculture Organization said that meat production is the number 1, 2, or 3 cause of all of the environments, every environmental harm, from the smallest and most local to the largest and most global. Deforestation, biodiversity loss, water use, water pollution, climate change, all of it. And we're now producing 40% more meat than we were in 2006 when that report came out. We're going to be producing something like 40 to 60% more meat in 2050. All of those problems get worse if that happens. So we really do, and there's not a plan B. People aren't going to suddenly stop eating meat after 50 years of trying. None of the other interventions are going to be up to the challenge of halting deforestation if we need 3 billion extra hectares of land. None of them, according to science, are going to even cause meat emissions to go down if we're eating 40 to 60% more meat in 2050. So we really do need to bring the will to this.
Well, finally, on the meat front, Bruce, or the meatless front, China is making itself central, perhaps, to the global economy by making itself the preeminent electro state. Do you think that the states that most embrace this meatless or this high-tech future will be the powers of the 21st century, and that in that sense, America really needs to embrace it?
I mean, that's a point that 10 Republican members of Congress made in a letter to the Department of Homeland Security and the Director of National Intelligence in the US. They looked at what China is doing in this sphere. So in their 5-year agricultural plan, in their 5-year bioeconomy plan, in multiple key speeches from President Xi, in one of them, he said that Chinese food self-sufficiency will come on the wings of food innovation. And if you look at the 20 most active scientific institutions in cultivated meat over the last 6 years, 8 of them are in China, 3 in Korea, 3 in Israel, 3 in the US, 8 in China. And so these Republican members of Congress, basically similar to what the Center for Strategic and International Studies said, basically asked the question, do we want China to dominate the global meat supply in the same way that China is now dominating on electric vehicles or solar panels or wind energy infrastructure, these sorts of things. And that is, competition with China, economic competitiveness, small business, American innovation. These are the sorts of things that are bipartisan. It didn't get a lot of attention, but just a couple of weeks ago, in a completely bipartisan way, both the House and the Senate reaffirmed American commitment to basic science in ways that I thought were really quite impressive. So the White House budget was going to slash the National Science Foundation, going to slash NIH funding, sort of funding up and down the line. And both Republicans and Democrats basically said, no, we're going to cut the NSF budget from $8.8 billion to $8.75 billion, where the proposal was to cut it more than in half. So I think we're going to see bipartisan support for science, bipartisan support for biotechnology, and alternative proteins, alternative meats will fit into that. It's my prediction.
Well, there you have it. The book is out today, Meat, How the Next Agricultural Revolution Will Transform Humanity's Favorite Food and Our Future. A nice optimistic note in our age of pessimism. Congratulations, Bruce, on the new book. And I think there is much to mull over. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Andrew. I really enjoyed chatting with you.